I have recently begun a study on the historical Adam. Now, a few years ago, studies on the historical Adam were really the in thing when it came to Christian scholarship, and I think it's really still around right now, as the literature from some of the scholars has now been around for the last 5 years and perhaps even more. I think the conversation is heating up even more. So I think it's still a relevant topic. I'm currently finishing up my master's degree in Christian apologetics, and I've decided, depending on when this video comes out, I may have already done it, but I've decided to study a paper on one of my last courses, which is scientific apologetics, on the historical Adam, because it's always been a fascination to me, and I want to try and get a bit of a better understanding of who Adam was, if Adam was even a real person, whether evolutionary biology actually is the best way to consider human origins, and if we have a common ancestor. I'm looking at this and I'm starting this evidence and this investigation right now. So again, this video may come out a little bit later, but the reason for this video is I want to probe you, the listener, you, the watcher, and ask you where you stand on this position, because I'm really entering this sphere as being completely open to whatever the evidence leads. I am open to whether if Adam was not a historical person, if Adam and Eve were just archetypes, they were just literary figures, metaphors maybe. I'm very much open to Genesis not being literal history. I'm open to common descent being the best evidence. I'm open for there to be a young Earth or an old Earth, or whether historical Adam was a Homo sapien, or whether he was a Neanderthal, or perhaps an older species, or other non-human or human archaic hominid. I am totally open to the evidence. So I'm going to begin this journey, and I'm going to, hopefully, as I research more and write my paper and consider the evidence, share some of the findings, and I'd love to have more of an open discussion and conversation. So I'd love to have more dialogue with those who are watching. And in this video, let me know what you think and where you stand currently on the historical Adam, and whether you think whether Adam was a real person or not, if that has any real significance to Christian doctrine. Is it necessary for Adam to be a real person in order for Christianity to be true? What does that mean about original sin and human origins and the Imago Dei, etc., etc.? So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. For my brief, and again, I've only just started this study, for my brief evaluation, I consider there to be 4 broad perspectives on the historical Adam. The first perspective is what I call the non-historical Adam. It's those who do not believe that Adam was a historical person, Genesis is not history, evolutionary biology is true, we all come from a common ancestor, God exists. This is, again, a Christian perspective I'm using here. Obviously, a non-Christian perspective would just say that God wasn't involved in it. But Christians who believe in the non-historical Adam are typically those who, there are some who are theistic evolutionists, there are some in that bracket that think that it was God who was guiding the process. Some think that no, God was around, but really he allowed the natural mutations to do its course, and we see the evolutionary methodology, the naturalism methodology within a theistic framework, and there are those who would interpret Genesis as purely literary, not historical myth that is just a simple reflection of an ancient Near Eastern creation story that is not supposed to be read literally in any way, shape, or form. So that is the first perspective. The second perspective is a fascinating perspective. I've called it, or I've labeled it, and most people label it this way. There are other ways to phrase it, but essentially it's the genealogical Adam view. Joshua Swamidass, and I think even the Old Testament scholar John Walton is sort of on this, in this wavelength. It's something like this, that evolutionary biology clearly teaches from the genetic code and the human genome that we all have a common ancestor. We are ancestors of the great apes, but we are also descendants of Adam. It's Joshua Swamidass who makes the distinction that there is something different between genetic ancestry and genealogical ancestry. Because if you look back at your ancestors, if you go back to the 7th, 8th, or 10th generation, because you share DNA with your most recent ancestors, if you go back to the 7th, 10th generation, something like that, these are what are called genetic ghost ancestors. That we share literally zero DNA with these ancestors, but they are still our ancestors. They are still our genealogical ancestors. They are in our genealogical record. So Joshua Swobodas, his view is that Adam and Eve are Homo sapiens. They were created by God in the garden, but there were people outside of the garden. And when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, their ancestors interbred with those outside of the garden, and those outside of the garden would have been those descended from the great apes. And they would also be human beings made in the image of God. And therefore, through the interbreeding of Homo sapiens and other human hominids, we are therefore descended from the great apes and also from Adam and Eve. They would interpret Genesis closer to young Earth creationists and those who believe that Adam could be a recent human being, maybe 6 to 10,000 years ago. He was a human. He was created de novo by God. So it's a very interesting concept that it's trying to blend what we learn from science and what we learn from theology. There is a limit to what theology can teach, and there's a limit between what science can teach. And this is sort of the view of the genealogical Adam view. Then you have the third view, which I've called the archaic Adam view, which, interestingly, young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists can both believe in this. They just have a different idea of dates and when these people were actually around. For example, William Lane Craig, who's an old Earth creationist, and Marcus Ross, paleontologist, who is a young Earth creationist. They would both say that at least Neanderthals and probably Homo heidelbergensis were probably human beings because of the fossil record and the archaeological record. We can see that they have human features and human characteristics in the way that they buried their dead and the way that they have artistic expertise, or at least artistic way of expressing themselves, which may consider rationality or cognitive functions that are greater than just animals. So the way that William Lane Craig looks at this is because he rejects the possibility of there being people outside of the garden, he simply just moves Adam way back into history. Because if Adam is what we know to be a member of the Homo heidelbergensis species, that must mean that Adam is back 750 to 500,000 years ago. Now, someone like Marcus Ross would say, I reject that date, but it seems to be quite clear that Neanderthals and the like are clearly human. So they would interpret Genesis as, well, William Lane Craig does at least, as mytho-history. Young Earth creationists would have taken more of a literalistic aspect, but mytho-history is the way that Dr. Craig phrases Genesis, and it's not saying that everything in Genesis is a pure myth, but it uses mythical elements to tell a historical story, essentially, the creation story, that God exists, created everything, and created human beings. He does believe that Adam and Eve are the two single human progenitors for the human race. So that's where William Lane Craig stands. And then you've got the fourth view, which I've labeled the Homo sapien Adam view, which is simply the case that Adam and Eve, Adam more specifically, was the first human being, created from the dust by God, special creation, and that those of Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis and the like, they are not human hominid creations by God that are loved and created by God, but they're ultimately not human beings. Now, the archaic Adam view would say, well, I got to reject that because from the archaeological evidence and from the fossil record, it seems to be quite clear that they are human beings and they share not only these characteristics and features, but they share our DNA. Those in the Homo sapien Adam view would say, well, I don't think we can say for certain that they have very, very similar genetic features. And also, and this is the kind of the biggest argument against macroevolution, it's that similarity is not the number one factor, the scientific proof for common ancestry. God, as a designer, could use for lack of a better term, an already existing prototype with all of its features that work and create something de novo. It's very, very plausible that God could do that. So, a very literal, not literal as in it has to be 6,000 years ago, because usually those who believe in this believe that the fossil record is correct and Homo sapiens could be around 100,000 years ago, something like that. But it's more of a straightforward reading of Genesis, that there was an Adam and that perhaps there were creatures outside of the garden that looked and acted like human beings, but ultimately they weren't. Could they have interbred with them? Quite possibly. Quite possibly. So what does that then go back to the genealogical Adam view? Does that help us? Maybe. Maybe that's true as well. So as I'm thinking about it, as you can see, at least when you're watching this video, I'm still considering the evidence and trying to compile all of that together. So let me know what you think as I begin this initial study of the historical Adam. Let me know your thoughts, and I would love to interact with those as I continually study this. And hopefully, I will be a lot more knowledgeable about this area of study as I finish this. So thank you for watching this. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next video.